Hollywood spent decades teaching you the same lie. A Native American camp in the Wild West was a scattered mess of tents, painted warriors yelling in circles, and nothing more. A scene of primitive chaos, ready to be swept away by army riders in glorious formation. That picture is about as accurate as calling an aircraft carrier a boat with a plane on top. The war camps of the Plains peoples were sophisticated structures with defense systems, military hierarchies, intelligence networks, spiritual rituals, and logistics that would have made many 19th century European generals scratch their heads in envy. And the most brutal proof of that lies in a valley in Montana on a June afternoon in 1876, when an American general who underestimated exactly that organization rode in with 215 men into a camp of 7,000 people, including 2,000 warriors, and never rode out. The general's name was Custer. The camp belonged to the Lakota and Cheyenne, and that wasn't luck. It was the consequence of centuries of military tradition that the Western world refused to acknowledge. This video is going to show you how these camps really worked. You'll never be able to watch those Western movies the same way again. The teepee was not a cheap tent. Before talking about military organization, it's necessary to destroy a basic misconception. The teepee. Cinema portrayed this structure as improvised, fragile, almost disposable. Reality is different. The poles of an average-sized teepee weighed around 400 pounds. The buffalo hide cover added another 100 to 150 pounds. A Lakota family transported that entire weight on horse-pulled travois during each migration. The teepee was designed for a specific function. Quick to dismantle and reassemble, it withstood the powerful plains winds, retained heat in winter, and allowed summer ventilation through adjustable smoke flaps. It required up to 8 tanned buffalo hides to cover a single 10-foot diameter structure. The door always faced east, toward the rising sun. And inside a war camp, each teepee had a specific place, determined by kinship, status, and function. There was nothing random about it. The sacred circle was not decoration. Lakota camps were organized in a circular formation known as the Tiospaye, the sacred hoop. It wasn't aesthetics, it was strategy and cosmology at the same time. Families knew exactly where to camp based on kinship and function within the community. The circle's opening faced east. At the center were gathering and ceremonial spaces. On the outer edges of the circle, warriors from military societies positioned their teepees. In practice, this meant any external attack would have to pass through the warriors first, before reaching women, children, and elders inside. It was defensive architecture embedded into daily life, so naturalized that a careless observer might mistake it for purely religious custom. It was both things simultaneously. Historian and ethnographer George Bird Grinnell documented this structure among the Cheyenne, where military societies took turns controlling which side of the circle they occupied during different periods of the year. Dog soldiers, the most feared police on the plains. The Cheyenne warrior societies numbered 6 in total. The most famous was the Hodematanio-o, known to whites as the dog soldiers. Inside a war camp, they weren't just fighters. They were police, perimeter security, ceremony organizers, and judges. When the camp moved, the dog soldiers worked the edges of the column, preventing individuals from breaking formation and prematurely attracting enemy attention. Their elite warriors wore the dog rope, a strip of buffalo hide adorned with feathers and beads, worn from the right shoulder under the left arm. In battle, the bravest would pin their dog rope to the ground with a sacred arrow and remain at that spot until the fight ended or another warrior released them. That wasn't suicide. It was a declaration that this warrior would not retreat, no matter what came. American accounts from the 1860s described these warriors as the hardest fighters to face on the plains. The chief's teepee was the largest in camp. Inside a plains war camp, hierarchy was visible to the naked eye. The principal leader's teepee was noticeably larger than the rest, and in most plains cultures, a banner or marker was tied to the tallest rear pole called the lifting pole, signaling the chief's position to the entire community. There was also a council teepee, a larger structure that accommodated leadership meetings, collective decision-making, and strategic planning. In Kiowa cultures, documented by early 20th century anthropologists, the social hierarchy was so formalized that the highest status families were called do-oi, family of many teepees, which literally indicated they had the resources to shelter followers and allies. An average-sized Kiowa camp in wartime ranged between 12 and 50 teepees per band, with each band occupying a specific position in the larger formation. The intelligence that made the U.S. Army look like amateurs. The 19th century U.S. Army had a structural problem. It didn't know the territory. Inaccurate maps, unfamiliar terrain, absence of reliable informants. The native peoples had the opposite. Their scout networks, called wolf soldiers among the Cheyenne, operated in radii of many miles around any camp, continuously monitoring enemy movement. When Colonel Custer approached the Greasy Grass Camp in June 1876, Lakota and Cheyenne warriors already knew of his presence long before he was in attack position. Lakota leader Low Dog declared, after the battle, I did not think anyone would come and attack us so strong as we were. The point isn't that they were caught off guard. The point is that they were so confident in their intelligence system's superiority that the 7th Cavalry's arrival surprised them less by tactical surprise and more by the attackers' suicidal audacity. The Sundance was not entertainment. Before any major military operation of the Plains peoples, there was a spiritual component that European observers dismissed as superstition, but that in practice functioned as a system of collective mobilization. The Sundance was the most important ritual of the year. It lasted between 4 and 8 days. Dancers went without food or water the entire period. In some cultures, including the Lakota and Cheyenne, the ceremony included ritual piercing, wooden skewers pushed through the dancer's chest skin, attached by cords to a central sacred pole, and warriors leaned back until the skin tore free. It wasn't sadism. It was a documented form of personal sacrifice for the entire community. In June 1876, Sitting Bull performed the Sundance in the Rosebud Valley and had a vision of soldiers falling upside down into the Lakota camp. That vision was communicated to the entire community. 2 things happened to a warrior with that. You enter battle with a conviction no 19th century military manual could teach. 7,000 people in a mile and a half. The Lakota Cheyenne camp at Greasy Grass in June 1876 is probably the best documented example of a large Native American war camp. Around 1,000 teepees stretched a mile and a half along the river valley. In total, between 6,000 and 8,000 people, 2,000 of whom were warriors. It was one of the largest Plains camps in recent memory. The U.S. Army had estimated 800 warriors total. It was off by a factor of 2.5. When Custer divided his command into 3 columns and attacked with 215 men through the main end, he found a defensive system that responded in a coordinated way, with Crazy Horse leading a flanking charge, Gaul pressing from another angle, and the Cheyenne Dog soldiers blocking the retreat. 215 men against 2,000 warriors in a camp that knew of their arrival. The result was called the Last Stand. In Lakota history, it's called simply the protection of the family, the vision. That mobilized an army, Sitting Bull wasn't just a war chief, he was a Wichasha Wakan, a medicine man of the Hunkpapa Lakota people. His function was to maintain the community's spiritual connection with larger forces, interpret dreams and visions, and communicate them to the group. At the Sundance ceremony held around June 6, 1876 in the Rosebud River Valley, Sitting Bull danced without eating or drinking for 2 days. He emerged from the ceremony with a specific vision, soldiers and their horses falling upside down into the Lakota camp, like grasshoppers from the sky. The interpretation was direct. A victory over the soldiers was coming. That vision was communicated to warriors from multiple groups who then gathered for what would become the Battle of Greasy Grass. When Custer attacked weeks later, the opposing camp had already internalized that prophecy. Believing in victory before battle isn't delusion. It's what modern psychologists call the confidence factor. The U.S. Army invested in uniforms and medals to produce the same effect. Sitting Bull did it with 2 days of fasting and a dance. Women built the camp. Among the Lakota, it was women's responsibility to set up and take down the teepees. Not as servitude, as specialization. An experienced woman could dismantle an entire teepee in under 15 minutes, reassemble it in the same time. That was critical logistical skill in a context where the ability to move a camp quickly could be the difference between survival and extermination. Women also controlled family property, including the teepees and domestic equipment. Among the Plains Apache, historical records explicitly state that women controlled and maintained all family belongings, including tipis. The U.S. Army discovered this the hard way on multiple occasions. It attacked camps and found that the women had already begun dismantling and moving the camp while warriors covered the retreat. Mobility was a weapon, and women were the engineers of that mobility. The Julesburg Trap. In November 1864, Colonel John Chivington attacked an unarmed Cheyenne camp at Sand Creek, Colorado, while the camp was flying the American flag and a white flag of surrender. He killed approximately 200 people, the majority women and children. Subsequent investigations by the U.S. Army itself condemned Chivington's tactics. What happened next is what textbooks rarely mention. The massacre survivors carried the war pipe from camp to camp among the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho. In January 1865, a coordinated group of 1,000 warriors attacked Camp Rankin in Julesburg, Colorado. They used decoys, warriors who lured troops out of the fort before the main attack. The fort was swept clean. Julesburg was attacked a second time in February. Then the main group moved north toward the Black Hills. The Sand Creek Massacre didn't silence the Cheyenne. It activated a chain of wars that lasted years. Chivington's consistency was truly admirable. Roman nose and the code that could not be broken. Among the best-known dog soldier warriors was Roman Nose, not a formal chief, but an elite fighter of the Cheyenne Crooked Lance Society. Roman Nose possessed a war bonnet that, according to Cheyenne spiritual tradition, protected him from wounds in battle with one specific condition. He could never eat food taken from water with a metal utensil. In September 1868, at the Battle of Beecher Island, Roman Nose discovered he had eaten bread made by a woman who had used a metal fork to turn the food. According to witnesses, he spent hours in purification rituals trying to undo the violation of the code, but declared there wasn't enough time. He entered the battle anyway. He was fatally wounded. You can interpret that as superstition. Or you can recognize that a man who deeply believed in a moral code entered battle knowing he might die. It's hard to decide which version is more impressive. The dog rope staked to the ground. The most documented and most misunderstood practice of the dog soldiers was the ritual of staking the dog rope into the ground during battle. Warriors who wore that special sash could, at a critical moment in combat, drive a sacred arrow through the rope's loop into the ground and remain fixed to that spot. They couldn't retreat. They could only advance or hold position until a companion released them by pulling out the arrow. The purpose was to create human anchors at strategic points on the battlefield, positions that would not be abandoned regardless of enemy pressure. It was an institutionalized form of extreme courage with direct tactical function. American history books typically describe native warriors as individual fighters without formation discipline. A warrior, literally staked to the ground by sacred vow, is not the opposite of military discipline. It is one of the most absolute forms of discipline that has ever existed. The camp that stopped 3 Army columns. In June 1876, the U.S. Army executed a 3-column convergence plan against the Lakota Cheyenne camps. General Crook advanced from the south, Colonel Gibbon from the north, and Custer from the east. The plan depended on the natives not having enough intelligence to perceive the encirclement until it was too late. On June 17th, before the main attack, Crazy Horse led warriors against Crook's column at the Battle of the Rosebud. Crook spent over 25,000 rounds of ammunition in 6 hours of combat and retreated to Wyoming. The southern column was out of the plan. 8 days later, Custer attacked without knowing he was alone. The U.S. Army planned a pincer operation with 3 columns. A nomadic camp in leather tents intercepted one of them before the main battle, neutralized it, and then dealt with the other 2. The Pentagon charges a premium to assemble operations like that. The Lakota and Cheyenne did it for free with horses, scouts, and a communication system the U.S. Army couldn't even map. Geronimo and the logic of the invisible camp. The Chiricahua Apache under Geronimo took the philosophy of the mobile camp to an extreme that caused the U.S. Army to spend 5,000 soldiers for 2 years to capture a group of 24 warriors, women, and children. That's right, 5,000 against 24. In 1886, when Geronimo finally surrendered to General Nelson Miles, there were 36 people with him. The entire armies of Mexico and the United States had spent months trying to locate this group. Apache camps were designed for invisibility, no daytime fire to avoid smoke, no obvious trails, no predictable patterns of movement. They understood that survival depended on never being where the enemy expected. And when General Crook finally got close enough to negotiate, it was because he used Apache scouts against other Apache, recognizing that knowledge of the territory was the only real advantage available. The last American military campaign against the Apache in the Southwest involved 5,000 troops in the field. The result was the capture of 36 people. The U.S. Army learned by making copies. Here's a historical irony that rarely appears in American curricula. The Green Berets, the United States Special Forces, use as their branch insignia 2 crossed arrows. That symbol was created in 1890 specifically for the Indian Scouts, the Native American trackers who served the U.S. Army. When Special Forces were formally established in 1952, they adopted the same symbol, explicitly acknowledging that their tactics, deep reconnaissance, unconventional warfare, small unit operations, integration with local populations, were derived from what Native American peoples had been practicing for centuries. Pawnee Scout leader Luther H. North was quoted saying, "Neither the wild tribes nor the government Indian Scouts ever adopted the white soldiers' tactics. They thought their own much better." Another chief of scouts, Stanton G. Fisher, said of American soldiers, "Uncle Sam's boys are too slow for this business." The army that decimated Native American peoples spent decades copying their military tactics. The peace camp that became a target. Cheyenne Chief Black Kettle was known as one of the most peace-oriented leaders across all the American Indian Wars. He signed multiple treaties with the U.S. government. When conflicts erupted elsewhere, he led his people toward American military posts, seeking protection. In November 1864, his camp at Sand Creek was flying both the American flag and a white flag of surrender when Colonel Chivington ordered the attack. In November 1868, 4 years later, Custer attacked Black Kettle's camp at the Washita River. Black Kettle and his wife were killed. After the battle, Custer killed 675 ponies from the camp, destroying the group's winter survival capacity. 2 attacks on the most peaceful leader of the American Western Indian Wars. The U.S. government signed treaties with more than 374 indigenous nations. It broke all 374. With Black Kettle, they went further. They ignored the white flag of surrender twice. The contrary warriors who walked backwards. Among the Lakota, there was a special category of warrior called Heyoka, the contrary warrior. These individuals were believed to have received visions from the thunder beings that compelled them to do the opposite of everything conventional. They could enter battle riding backwards. They could speak in reverse. They wore winter clothing in summer. Among the Cheyenne, the contrary warriors of the Honokao served a similar function, members who had proven extreme bravery by riding backwards into battle. This seemingly absurd behavior was not a sign of madness. It was a manifestation of sacred power, according to these cultures' traditions, conferring unique spiritual protection on those warriors. Accounts from American fighters who faced native warriors on the plains frequently describe the disorientation caused by tactics completely outside any European manual. Seeing a warrior attacking with his back to the enemy while other warriors advanced normally was exactly the kind of thing that disoriented soldiers trained to expect predictable formations. The Dakota camp that became a concentration camp. In November 1862, more than 1,600 Dakota non-combatants, primarily women, children, and elders, arrived at Fort Snelling in Minnesota and were enclosed inside a wooden structure over 12 feet high, surrounding an area of 2 to 3 acres. They were not prisoners of war. They were civilians who had not participated in the Dakota War of 1862. Between the winter of 1862 and 1863, an estimated 130 to 300 people died inside, primarily from measles and harsh conditions. On February 16, 1863, the U.S. Congress passed a law annulling all existing treaties with the Dakota people and confiscating all their lands and annuities. In March of the same year, a second law ordered the complete removal of the Dakota from Minnesota. The structure beside Fort Snelling is what the Minnesota Historical Society, the state's official organization, explicitly calls a concentration camp. The largest mass execution in American history. The Dakota War of 1862 ended with the U.S. Army capturing a large number of Dakota warriors. A military commission tried 392 Dakota. 303 were sentenced to death. President Abraham Lincoln personally reviewed the cases and commuted most sentences, releasing all but 38. On December 26, 1862, in Mankato, Minnesota, the 38 were hanged simultaneously in the largest mass execution in American history. Lincoln approved the hangings, the same administration that issued the Emancipation Proclamation 2 days later, on January 1, 1863, mass executed indigenous citizens. Someone should put that in the same paragraph in American textbooks, but strangely, they rarely appear together. The Navajo camp. That General Carson erased. In 1863, General James Carleton selected an arid, nearly treeless site in the Bosque Redondo Valley, 300 miles from Navajo homeland, and decided it would be the new home of 10,000 Navajo. Colonel Kit Carson was put in charge of executing the operation. His tactic was to burn crops, destroy peach orchards the Navajo had cultivated for generations, and poison water sources. When the Navajo who resisted could no longer feed themselves, most surrendered. In 1864, around 8,500 Navajo were forced to march between 300 and 400 miles, depending on the route, to Bosque Redondo, a march that killed hundreds. The Navajo call this event the Long Walk. At Bosque Redondo, conditions were so deplorable that the U.S. government itself eventually acknowledged the project's failure. In 1868, a treaty was signed allowing the Navajo to return to part of their original territory. Carleton planned that. The Navajo people survived it. The Comanche and the horse. The Comanche, who called themselves Numunu, the people, began as part of the Shoshone tribe in the early 1700s and migrated south in search of Spanish horses. What happened next redefined the Plains Wars for a century and a half. The Comanche became the most feared horsemen in the Americas. Their camp system was structured around the extended family unit and adjacent teepees, with that family group serving as the primary unit of economic production. Camp mobility was directly proportional to the number of horses available. A high-status Comanche warrior had herds of hundreds of horses. They knew how to breed, train, and use horses for specific purposes: hunting, warfare, transport. When the U.S. Army finally cornered the Cheyenne camp at the Washita River in 1868 and killed 675 horses, it wasn't just cruelty, it was the deliberate destruction of a mobility infrastructure. Without horses, there was no war camp. That was the most real weapon the U.S. Army had. The man who lived in a teepee inside the fort. Sergeant I.C.O., the anglicized name of a Kiowa born around 1849, served as a U.S. Army scout from 1889 until his death in 1927. Unlike most scouts who were deactivated, the U.S. Congress, at the request of future Army Chief of Staff Hugh L. Scott, passed legislation in 1915 allowing I.C.O. to serve on active duty for the rest of his life. He spent his final years living in a teepee in a remote area of Fort Sill, Oklahoma. In 1925, he was personally invited by President Calvin Coolidge for a visit to the White House. A Kiowa who had fought in the Plains Indian Wars ended his life as a presidential guest. And yet he chose to live in a teepee inside an American military base. Some call that adaptation. ICO probably called it dignity. The battle that textbooks call a defeat. The Battle of Little Bighorn on June 25, 1876, is frequently presented in American curricula as a tragic event that led to the inevitable end of the Indian Wars. Rarely mentioned is what the battle actually was from a tactical standpoint: a humiliating defeat of a professional military unit by a force that was defending civilians. Custer divided his regiment into 3 columns, without adequate reconnaissance, without reliable intelligence on enemy strength, and against the advice of his own subordinate officers. The army had estimated 800 warriors. There were 2,000. The main battle lasted long enough, according to Lakota accounts, for a hungry man to eat a full meal. 215 soldiers were killed. The Lakota and Cheyenne lost 32 warriors. The U.S. government responded by flooding the region with additional troops. What is presented as the inevitable end of the Indian Wars was in practice the force escalation the U.S. government needed to execute after a defeat it never expected to suffer: the Ghost Dance and the Forbidden Camp. In 1890, a spiritual movement known as the Ghost Dance spread among the Plains peoples. The prophet Wovoka, a Nevada Paiute, preached that specific ritual dances would bring back the dead, restore the lands, and make the white men disappear. The U.S. government classified the movement as a national security threat and sent troops to suppress it. Sitting Bull was killed by Indian police sent to arrest him in December 1890 while he was on the Standing Rock Reservation. 2 weeks later, on December 29, 1890, the 7th Cavalry surrounded a group of unarmed Lakota Sioux camped at Wounded Knee, South Dakota, to confiscate weapons. The result was the death of approximately 300 people, the majority Lakota civilians. 20 medals of honor were distributed to American soldiers who participated. It wasn't a battle. It was a massacre of civilians who were camped on a reservation. The Ghost Dance was banned. The medals remained. The territory that was never supposed to end. In 1868, the Second Fort Laramie Treaty guaranteed the Lakota and Dakota Sioux exclusive possession of the territory west of the Missouri River, including the Black Hills. 6 years later, in 1874, Custer himself led an expedition of 1,200 men through the Black Hills and confirmed the presence of gold. Miners began flooding the territory. The U.S. government, unable to remove the invaders and unable to convince the Lakota to sell the land, simply issued an ultimatum. All Indians on lands outside the reservations would be classified as hostile starting January 31, 1876. The likelihood of that message reaching hunters scattered across remote territory in the middle of winter was practically zero. The government knew that. It was the pretext they needed for the military campaign that followed. The Second Fort Laramie Treaty was 8 years old when the U.S. government decided it wasn't worth the paper it was written on. Gold found, treaty forgotten. The consistency is touching. Chief Joseph and the 800 miles of impossible. In 1877, a group of approximately 800 Nez Perce people, including warriors, women, children, and elders, attempted to escape to Canada to avoid reservation confinement. What followed was a flight of over 1,700 kilometers through some of the most difficult terrain in the American Northwest, pursued by multiple U.S. Army columns. For 4 months, the group led by Chief Joseph, whose native name was Hinmatooyalahtikit, thundered traveling to the loftier mountain heights, defeated or evaded the U.S. Army in at least a dozen engagements. When finally surrounded just 40 kilometers from the Canadian border in October 1877, it was winter. They were without supplies and exhausted. Chief Joseph's surrender speech was recorded by American officers. The last line of the English version says, "I will fight no more forever." The group had traveled over 1,700 kilometers carrying elders, sick, and children fighting the U.S. Army along the way. 40 kilometers short. The Tipi painter who survived Little Bighorn, he, Nupa Wanaka, known in English as Joseph No Two Horns, was a Hunkpapa Lakota warrior who participated in the Battle of Greasy Grass in 1876. He fought in 40 battles throughout his life. In the reservation era, when most traditional cultural expressions were actively suppressed, Joseph No Two Horns became an artist. He painted on teepee canvases scenes of battles, war horses, and stories from his life, including events from Little Bighorn. These painted tipis, shields, and horse effigies are today in museums. The tradition of historical record-keeping art among Plains warriors has a long history, accelerated after the Cheyenne and other peoples gained access to pencils and ledger notebooks through trade in the 19th century. The Cheyenne Dog Soldier Ledger Book, a marbleized cover composition ledger containing 106 color pencil drawings by 14 different warrior artists, is today one of the most important historical documents about the Plains Wars of the 1860s, the camp that was never found. Geronimo's reputation as the hardest warrior to locate in the American Southwestern Wars is based on concrete numbers. Between 1881, when he first escaped from San Carlos, and 1886, when he finally surrendered, Geronimo and his group repeatedly escaped or evaded capture by both the U.S. Army and the Mexican Army. On one occasion, he escaped from San Carlos with approximately 400 people in tow, according to General George Crook's records. Chiricahua Apache camps were designed for zero visibility. No daytime fire, no obvious trails, movement in unpredictable patterns. General Crook formally acknowledged that no white soldier could track the Apache like other Apache could. He used Apache scouts against Geronimo. When Geronimo finally surrendered, the last documented words attributed to him to General Miles were, "It is senseless to fight when you cannot hope to win." 5,000 soldiers, 2 years, 36 people. The scout who embarrassed the army, Sergeant William Alchese, also called the Little One, was a White Mountain Apache born in 1853. He enlisted as a scout in 1872 at Camp Verde, Arizona. In 1872 and 73, he guided General Crook's columns during the winter campaign against the Chiricahua Apache, operating in terrain the U.S. Army simply couldn't navigate without a guide. Alcacé and 9 other Apache scouts received the Medal of Honor for valiant conduct during those campaigns. The citation for all 10 specifically mentioned gallant conduct during the campaigns and engagements with the Apaches. After the wars ended, the U.S. Army treated Alchese and the scouts the same way it treated captured prisoners of war. They were sent to Florida for incarceration. General Crook spent the rest of his life publicly defending Apache rights, arguing against the imprisonment of allies who had been fundamental to his victories. Some generals learned lessons. Too late to change the dispatches already sent. The tradition that survived the government. In 1882, the Canadian government began persecuting Sundance practitioners. In 1895, an amendment to the Canadian Indian Act formally prohibited any ceremony involving mutilation of people or animals, a provision created specifically to suppress the Sundance. The U.S. government adopted similar measures on reservations. The last Sundance following the full traditional practice was recorded in 1881. The ceremonies continued in attenuated form, adapted, often clandestinely. In 1951, Canada formally repealed the ban. In 1978, the U.S. Congress passed the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, guaranteeing protection for indigenous religious practices. The Sundance returned to public celebration. In 1993, 500 representatives from 40 different tribes gathered at a summit to declare war against the exploitation and misrepresentation of Lakota sacred ceremonies. 92 years after being banned, the movement was strong enough to declare war in its own name. What remained of the plains? In 1946, the Little Bighorn Battlefield was declared an American National Monument. The official name was Custer Battlefield National Monument. In 1991, after decades of pressure from indigenous groups and historians, the U.S. Congress approved the name change to Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument. In 2003, an Indian memorial was added to the site, honoring the Lakota, Sioux, Arikara, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors. It took 127 years for the site to have a memorial for the warriors who won the battle that gave the place its name. To put it in perspective, if you built a memorial for American soldiers who died on D-Day in Normandy in 1944 and waited the same interval of time to add a memorial for the German soldiers who defended the beach, you would be inaugurating that memorial now in 2071. History has its own rhythm, especially when written by the winners.